As we go to the end of the 19th century, we're going to look at immigration and then the urban landscape, the changing culture of the United States, and then the presidencies of Garfield, Arthur, and Cleveland. The picture that you see there is the main reception hall at Ellis Island, which is in New York Harbor, which is where between 1893 and 1943, more than 1 million immigrants came through and were processed, checked medically, and so forth. For those that are fans of the Godfather movies, the opening scenes of The Godfather Part 2 is young Vito Andolini, later to be named Vito Corleone, on Ellis Island, quarantined because he had smallpox, I believe, or was in danger of transmitting smallpox. Ellis Island had fallen into disrepair for a long time. It has since been completely restored and is now on the U.S. Register of Historic Places and is one of the most visited spots in all of New York City. America's lifeblood has always been and will remain, no matter what the political dialogue, immigration. What was immigration in the late 19th century? For the most part, it was foreign workers who were seeking jobs. Now, some of them were coming for the purpose of settling down permanently. Others were coming for the purpose of earning enough money to bring the rest of their family over, while a third group wanted to work, earn enough money, and then go back home to their families. Not all went back home to their families, most stayed. Between 1870 and 1880, most of the immigrants to the United States were coming from Ireland, Britain, most notably Scotland, Scandinavia, and Germany. But by 1880, that shifted. Now a new class of immigrant was coming through. This group of immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, most notably Italy and Greece. Where did they settle? They settled mostly in the manufacturing belt. The manufacturing belt is now called the Rust Belt of today, basically going from Duluth, Minnesota, all the way around the Great Lakes, up into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo, New York. As many of these immigrants were coming in who were not considered to be white at the time, were Catholic, you had nativist pushback, as you have always had in this country. A dim view of immigrants. They're coming to take our jobs. They're coming to pollute our white culture. And so you had groups like the American Protective Association, very anti-Catholic in its bias, making sure that the people that were coming in were relegated to certain neighborhoods in the city. What these immigrants were coming to were American cities that had undergone a major transformation from the Civil War onward. The entire population of the United States was beginning a shift during the Civil War. At the beginning of the Civil War, most Americans lived in small towns and on farms. At the end of the Civil War, now most Americans were starting to move towards cities. Immigration and manufacturing were growing the cities. However, as the cities grew larger, many people said, oh my God, we're losing identity, we're losing our sense of cultural cohesion and so forth in the big metropolis amalgamation of people. That is actually not the case. This was not a loss of small community. Instead, the cities became repositories of small communities. You had, of course, Little Italy's in Chicago and New York and other cities, Irish sections like the Irish Channel of New Orleans and so forth. The small neighborhoods and the parishes, especially around the Catholic parishes, maintained a sense of identity in these small communities. The big cities of the time were New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan was growing, New Orleans in the south, Memphis, Tennessee, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, and so forth. Most of these great urban areas were what's called walking cities. That is, you could walk from your home to the business district of these cities without spending a great deal of time in transit. And as the cities grew larger, you did have mass transit. That is, mostly rail. First horse or mule-pulled rail, and then electrical rail cars. in some cases, gas combustion rail cars, but that was very rare. Mass transit allowed the cities to expand further out. But in the business districts, as the cities grew, and to keep things compact, you now had the growth of skyscrapers. Skyscrapers were made possible through the industrial age, because of the industrial age. Why? Because you had the refinement of steel. And where you had the refinement of steel, now you could build buildings higher and taller using just a steel frame skeleton. The old brick buildings could not continually go up and up and up, because eventually the weight of the bricks would cause the building to collapse in upon itself. But if you had steel frame, where you put simply a skin of bricks around and used other materials as well, then you could have yourself a skyscraper. This building that you see here is called the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. It is the first skyscraper. It is still there to this day. As you can tell, it's not one of those great Empire State Building or World Trade Center skyscrapers, but for the time, it was incredibly tall. What was the allure of the urban landscape? Business districts. This is where you went shopping. This is where you could set up your law office or your doctor's office. Many of the buildings that are downtown New Orleans, for instance, that are now hotels, just hotels as the song goes. One time they were department stores on the bottom, and they were office buildings on the upper floors. You also had wholesalers that worked down by the wharves and the railroad yards. They also had a great deal of hotels and entertainment. Now, of course, on Canal Street in New Orleans, you have the Sanger, the State Palace Theater, the Joy, the Cine Royale, and so forth. And in the 1970s and 80s, when I was a young man, they had fallen into disrepair and disrepute. They become porn theaters, and then they got reclaimed again and have become part of Broadway South, especially the Sanger Theater, which had always been a high-class theater. This is not to say that there weren't problems in the urban landscape. There were crowded tenements and unsanitary conditions and undeveloped infrastructure, especially when it came to water, sewage, and treatment and bringing in water. This, of course, led to a number of problems, and oftentimes political corruption got in the way. You had city machines, the Tammany Hall of New York, the old regulars of New Orleans, and so forth. You had a great deal of vice that went on in the urban landscape, and cities have always been a repository of vice. The bad conditions of cities came to a climax several times in major American cities. You had the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. There was a fire in New Orleans in the 1880s, and the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was followed by a fire that did far more devastation than the actual earthquake did. And the reason being is that the buildings were not built to code. You did not have adequate water supply to put out the fires, and there you see the landscape of Chicago in 1871, supposedly caused when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern in its barn and set the whole city on fire. What the cities and the urban landscape was showing was that there was a changing culture in the United States. As you had industrialization and mass industrialization, you had a new business middle class, which we call the white-collar class. That is, you had to have accountants, you had to have clerks, you had to have managers, and so forth. This was the white-collar class, the middle class. And they wanted to live in the suburbs because they did not want to live in the dirty tenements of the inner city, and they had a standard of wealth or a level of wealth that meant that they wanted to live, at least in part, like the wealthy did. And the suburbs were the place. In order to keep up with their wealthy counterparts, they begin to buy things, consumerism, and so forth. They established public and parochial schools. Most Protestants sent their children to the public schools, whereas most Catholics tended to send their kids to Catholic schools or parish schools, what we call parochial schools. With the white-collar class increasing and the need for skilled and learned people, especially in mathematics and science, you had an increased college enrollment at the time. You had women's colleges. For instance, Harvard Women's College was called Radcliffe, and Helen Keller was their most famous alumna. Tulane has, and to this day still has, Newcomb College, although it's been subsumed into the rest of the university. With the white-collar class and so forth, you had a cult of domesticity that resurged again in the late 19th century. The cult of domesticity means separate gender spheres. It does not mean that women are relegated to the home. It means that they have a separate sphere than men. They would form women's clubs, especially temperance societies, and of course they began to agitate once more for the vote. What also existed in the cities was a gay and lesbian subculture that it was sort of a don't ask, don't tell culture. It was not as morally repugnant back then to be homosexual. And oftentimes the lines between the heterosexual and homosexual communities blurred far more than you would think in this day and age. Whereas homosexual and heterosexual men especially move very freely about next to each other, sort of in a tacit understanding of each other's presence at the time, and that sometimes it was not always set who was homosexual and who was heterosexual. So you're seeing that the closet that existed in the 1950s and 60s and went into the 70s and 80s. Now we're out, of course, homosexuals are out of the closet now. Okay, everybody's out of the closet, but the closet didn't always exist, and the closet was not something that was sort of like a coffin in which you were kept. You got out, you got around, and you were able to exist rather peacefully with the rest of society. 1881 was the year of three presidents. In 1880, the Republican Party had split into two factions. You had what were called the stalwarts and the half-breeds. Stalwarts were a little bit more strident and doctrinaire and less inclined to go along with anything the Democratic Party wanted. Meanwhile, the half-breeds were sort of the bipartisans. They were happy to reach across the aisle. Most of the Republican Party was half-breed, but there was enough stalwart faction in the Republican Party that made them a force with which you had to deal. And so, when the Republican convention met in 1880, the divisions threatened to tear the Republican Party apart, until James Garfield, whom you see in the upper right-hand corner, stood up and made a speech saying, "Who are we going to have to unify us together, because we have to be unified?" And all the people at the convention said, "It's you, Garfield." And Garfield said, "Whoa, time out, I wasn't nominating myself." They said, "We don't care, we're nominating you." And so Garfield was nominated representing the half-breeds. They nominate Chester Allen Arthur, who you see there in the lower right-hand corner, as the stalwart representative on the ticket, and he was the vice presidential nominee. And so you had Garfield and Arthur working together. The Democrats choose a war hero of their own, Winfield Scott Hancock, the famous general who had been at the Battle of Gettysburg at Cemetery Ridge when Pickett's charge came up the ridge, had been wounded seriously but recovered. This was going to be a very, very close race, and Garfield wins. He wins a very close popular vote, but a very large electoral vote. Well, here's the problem back then, is that you had all kinds of different workers working for you to make sure that you won the race. And you didn't know everybody who worked for you to make you win the race. But once you get sworn in as president, all those people are coming to the White House looking for a job. Everybody who worked very hard for your campaign wants a job. For instance, current Attorney General of the United States, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. He was Trump's prime helper in Congress and an early member of the campaign, and for that he's been rewarded with the spot of Attorney General. Okay, So, one of the people that comes to Garfield is a fellow by the name of Charles Guiteau. And Charles Guiteau had worked very fervently for the Garfield campaign. He was a member of the stalwart faction. Charles Guiteau says to President Garfield, "I would like to be ambassador to France." Well, ladies and gentlemen, Charles Guiteau had about as much qualification for being ambassador to France as I have for being a professor of algebra. Not going to happen. Furthermore, Charles Guiteau was probably suffering from a mental disease like syphilis or something like that. He was turned down, and Guiteau said, obviously Garfield's the problem, and so he shot Garfield in July of 1881 at the Union Station in Washington. Garfield was shot twice. They could not find one of the bullets, and he lingered on until September of 1881, and essentially it was his doctor who killed him. And I certainly hope you take the time to watch for extra credit The Murder of a President, and you'll get to see just how shameful it was what happened to James Abram Garfield. Well, Guiteau, when he shoots Garfield, runs out of the station yelling, "I am a stalwart, and now Arthur is the president." And of course he was tackled right away, he was put on trial, and eventually he was hung. This leaves Chet Arthur as the president of the United States. Now Chet Arthur, many of the stalwarts said, "Oh, excellent, this is going to be wonderful. We're going to have our stalwart programs pushed through that Garfield would never have pushed through." Well, the very congenial Chet Arthur suddenly becomes President Chester Arthur very quickly. And he says, "I am going to follow through on Garfield's programs, not on my own." And so many of the stalwarts hated him and would not nominate him again for another term. But Arthur was a good soldier. Even though he was a stalwart, he was not a nasty individual or anything like that. And in truth, the job was a little bit more than Chet Arthur could handle, because 4 months after he left office, he died of a heart attack. There was another faction that was growing within the Republican Party, and this group is called the Mugwumps. The Mugwumps were reformist Republicans, and reform means that they're trying to go after the spoils system. They looked at the spoils system as being one of the reasons why Garfield was killed in the first place, and they said, we need to fix this. The Mugwumps tended to be very self-righteous, very strident. There you see Carl Schurz in the upper right. He is a German immigrant to the United States who became a United States senator, and he was well known for his integrity, but he was also something of an arrogant prick, very much like James Comey would be seen today. Above reproach, definitely somebody who can be trusted, but also somebody who could be very, very self-righteous. So they attacked the spoils system, and the Mugwumps enact civil service laws. Civil service laws mean that your job as a federal worker is protected despite the fact that an administration can turn over, and it keeps you from having to work for a particular candidate, that you're going to be hired based on your talent, not upon your political loyalties. Well, in 1884, the Republicans decide against Chester Arthur, and they choose instead James Blaine from the state of Maine. That right there has a great connotation to it, and it was a easily understood motto. However, Blaine was opposed by the Mugwumps, and of course, as you know, the Mugwumps are very self-righteous. The Democrats choose the governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, not the governor of Ohio, despite his last name, governor of New York. Here you have a very nasty campaign. A lot of personal insults get thrown back and forth by the candidates' campaigns. Remember, candidates did not appeal directly to the voters that often. They didn't make many speeches during the campaign. But Blaine, at a reception, made a speech called Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion, in which he essentially characterized Catholic voters as being drunks, being papists, and not being loyal. And with that, he lost the entire Catholic vote that all turned toward Grover Cleveland. And so Grover Cleveland became the President of the United States in 1885. Now, Grover Cleveland's presidency, he's going to be the only president to serve non-consecutive terms as president. He attempts to annex Hawaii in 1893, but this fails. And one of the reasons why it fails is race. Because most Americans in Congress, when they were debating whether or not to annex Hawaii, said, no, we can't annex Hawaii. Too many dark-skinned people in Hawaii. 5 years later, they do annex Hawaii. What had changed? Well, you just have to find out in the next lessons.